Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Walker Lee's presentation. Let me just pull up my Walker's short bio. Walker Raymond Lee is a postdoctoral research associate at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. Walker's research explores the design space of climate interaction. What can climate models tell us about how different climate intervention strategies might affect the Earth system in different ways? From 2018 to 2023, Walker studied at Cornell University, where he compared simulations of stratospheric aerosol injection at various latitudes, altitudes, and seasons, and used feedback control algorithms to determine whether and how different strategies could be used to prevent certain impacts from global warming. After completing his doctorate in 2023, Walker began as a postdoc at NCAR, where he is working to apply the same analysis to simulations of marine cloud brightening interventions. And thank you very much, Walker, to join us. I have to say that I have listened to Walker on the Review or Two podcast. He's done a number of podcasts, including some earlier ones on stratospheric aerosol injection. He was part of the Cornell group, what's often referred to as the Cornell SAI group that includes Doug McMartin, who also did a presentation for HPAC as well, and other folks that frankly we have cited quite a bit and talked about quite a bit in the HPAC papers and also in our discussions. So I was very pleased to hear that Walker has now turned his attention to marine cloud brightening, which of course is another major interest of many of us as a direct climate cooling strategy. And I'm really excited to hear what Walker has to say. And I think with that, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Walker Lee.
Thank you very much, Ron. Big thanks to Ron for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I had a lot of fun and also learned a lot from putting this talk together. Yes, I'm Walker Lee. I'm a postdoc at NCAR in Boulder, Colorado. And today I'm going to talk a bit about marine cloud brightening, specifically the current state of the research as it comes to using marine cloud brightening to cool the entire planet. So starting at the beginning, I'm sure that most of the people in this call have seen this figure before. Solar geoengineering refers to the deliberate reflection of sunlight to cool the planet, and it's known by a myriad of other names, including solar radiation management. Climate intervention is one of the popular names today, sometimes simply geoengineering. The context in which solar geoengineering is talked about is always in the context of global warming. Out of all of the possible futures that we could see for this planet, I'm sure that most, if not all of us, would prefer a future where there is no global warming. However, it's becoming less and less likely that that future is going to be the one that is realized. And as a result, many people, including myself, are studying ways in which we could cool the surface and reduce some of the impacts of global warming. In particular, today, I'm going to be talking about marine cloud brightening. Marine cloud brightening refers to a mode of solar geoengineering where aerosols, usually in the form of sea salt, are sprayed into low marine clouds. And the aerosols provide surfaces which water droplets can condense onto and form cloud nuclei. More water droplets within the same cloud means it is visually brighter and reflects more sunlight. If you've ever seen a satellite photo over the ocean, you might have been able to pick out ship tracks, which are often visible from above due to the same phenomenon. So primarily today, I'm going to be talking about marine cloud brightening, or MCB, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about stratospheric aerosol injection. And the reason is because, as Ron mentioned, I've only been working on marine cloud brightening for about a year. Before that, I spent 5 years with Doug's group at Cornell working mainly on stratospheric aerosol injection. And so a lot of my understanding of the current state of marine cloud brightening research comes through the lens of having looked at stratospheric aerosol injection for a long time. And so I'm going to be providing some background about stratospheric aerosol injection research as well.
Walker, I'm sorry. Walker, just one thing. Some folks would like you to speak a little slower if you could. Sorry, we have non-English
Oh,
speakers, and that would make it
of
easier.
course.
Sorry,
Yes,
sorry to interrupt.
absolutely.
Yep.
No problem at all. I'm happy to try and speak slower. I tend to speak quickly, so thank you for interrupting. Um, so uh, let's go to the next slide. So all climate intervention research is at least somewhat controversial. And this is a really cool figure by Michael Diamond and company. He's a professor at Florida State. And the opinions about marine cloud brightening and marine cloud brightening research are probably as varied as the people in this call. There's probably as many different opinions as there are people in this call. I've met people who think that marine cloud brightening is the future and that absolutely is something that the human race is going to try and do, possibly within the next, I don't know, 50 years. And I've met people who think that marine cloud brightening research is a complete waste of time. However, regardless of where you fall in that particular scale, we need to be constantly evaluating and reevaluating the state of the research and where we are and whether the outcomes will be positive. And so this is a list of possible reasons why we might choose to abandon marine cloud brightening research. And most of my research focuses on this one down here, which is the large-scale circulation response, and refers especially to temperature and precipitation patterns, but also other aspects of the climate. If marine cloud brightening or any other form of climate intervention produces a climate state which is even less desirable than global warming without climate intervention, then that's something we should know. And so my research focuses on looking at different strategies of marine cloud brightening and stratospheric aerosol injection to try and determine how they impact the Earth system and whether or not it would be better or worse than global warming without climate intervention. So I've mentioned that I look at different strategies, and this is important because different strategies impact the Earth system in different ways and therefore have different outcomes. When I say different strategies, I mean questions like where are we deploying our intervention, when, what time of year, and how big is the intervention? One of my pet peeves in the field is that a lot of people are really fond of saying things like stratospheric aerosol injection does this or marine cloud brightening does this. And that's one of my pet peeves because such statements are often not completely true because different strategies impact the Earth system in different ways. For example, for stratospheric aerosol injection, it's well known that injecting at the equator, where the aerosols are over confined to the tropical height, is going to affect the Earth system differently than injecting at multiple different latitudes to try and cool the planet relatively evenly. And that will give different responses still than if you tried to focus your injection on the polar regions to try and preferentially cool the Arctic and or the Antarctic. Another consideration is the scope of your injection or your intervention. For example, you could have a constant intervention where the magnitude does not change with time. However, global warming is not expected to be constant. The temperatures are expected to increase linearly for as long as, at least in the short term, while greenhouse gas concentrations go up over time. And as such, you could have an intervention that expands with time in order to match the pace of global warming. But of course, your estimate for how much you need to expand your intervention with time your initial guess might be incorrect. So you could go a step further and employ some kind of feedback algorithm in which any uncertainties or nonlinearities are corrected during the process by adjusting the intervention as it happens. So I'm going to give a little more background on the state of the SAI design space SAI stratospheric aerosol injection before I delve into marine cloud brightening. In particular, I want to focus on three prominent experiments. The first one is called GLENS, which is the Geoengineering Large Ensemble, and it was the first large ensemble of stratospheric aerosol injection published by Simone Tilms and company in 2018 using the Community Earth System model. The sequel to GLENS, called ARISE for Assessing Responses and Impacts of Solar Climate Intervention on the Earth System, was published a few years later by Jager Richter in 2022. And this was a very similar experiment to GLENS, but using an updated version of the Community Earth System model version 2. And the last one I want to mention is called the G6 experiment. G6 is part of the Geoengineering Model Intercomparison Project, or GeoMIP. So this is a proposed experiment that was published by Dan Visioni, Alan Robach, and company last year that proposes sort of the next generation of geoengineering experiments for stratospheric aerosol injection. And so these are three pretty prominent experiments that are replicated across different models. And the reason I bring this up is that there's a lot of similarities between them. For example, if you look at where they're injecting the aerosol precursor, Glens and Arise SAI 1.5 both inject at 30 degrees north and south and 15 degrees north and south. And G6 1.5K SAI is a simplified version of the first two experiments that only injects at 30 north and 30 south. All of these have a similar timeline. Glens used a high warming RCP scenario and tried to restore global temperature maps to about the 2020 average. And then Arise and G6 both use a moderate warming scenario and try to restore global temperatures to about the 2030 average. The targets were all temperature based. T0 represents global mean temperature, so-called because these are temperature variables that are mapped onto Legendre polynomials, which is, I don't need to go and do it here, but it's basically a fancy way of mapping temperature patterns. T1 represents the inner hemispheric temperature gradient, and T2 is the equator to pole temperature gradient. So Glens and Arise have the same temperature targets, and then G6 only uses global mean temperature. And for all three of these experiments, the injection quantities were chosen via feedback algorithm. And the feedback algorithms for both of the latter experiments were derived from the original Glens feedback algorithm. So what we see here is that these same sort of patterns of temperature targets and injection locations are being used over and over again in stratospheric aerosol injection research. And the reason for that is that it works. These experiments produce temperature maps, which are very similar to the target temperature maps, which they are trying to replicate by cooling the planet, the entire planet relatively evenly by an order of magnitude equivalent to 30, 40, or 50 years of global warming in whatever scenario they are being conducted in. And as a result, these experiments sort of pass what I would call the initial smell test, where there are no huge regional discrepancies in temperature and precipitation. And as a result, the results are being looked into in more detail. People are taking the model output from these experiments and they're analyzing more detailed aspects of the climate system, permafrost in the Arctic, the Greenland ice sheet, and the Southern Ocean near the Antarctic ice shelves. People are looking at impacts on ecosystems and wildlife, and people are looking at impacts to tropical precipitation and monsoons. And so as a result, the stratospheric aerosol injection research has kind of converged around this type of global strategy. That's not to say that it's the only possible strategy or the optimal one, but a lot of people are looking at very similar experiments. And the reason that I give this background is because I don't think that the same is true for marine cloud brightening research. For starters, the marine cloud brightening design space is a little more complicated than that of stratospheric aerosol injection. There are a couple of new dimensions to the marine cloud brightening problem, which are not present in stratospheric aerosol injection research. For example, in stratospheric aerosol injection research, the primary component of the design space is the latitude of injection. The longitude of injection does not matter very much in climate models. And most people, when setting up experiments, the main thing that they care about is the injection location and the injection quantity. But with marine cloud brightening, it's a bit more complicated because when you're up in the stratosphere, it's relatively symmetric about the equator, but marine cloud brightening is done at the surface, which is very much not symmetric. Additionally, a lot of Earth system models and climate models have pretty well-developed aerosol representation because volcanic eruptions are a really important part of the climate system. However, with marine cloud brightening, clouds, and especially cloud aerosol interactions, are among the single biggest challenges that climate modelers face when trying to improve their models. So How is MCB implemented in the model? There are multiple different ways that climate models choose. Some choose to simulate sea salt injection, which is the method by which marine cloud brightening would be implemented in real life. The advantages of this method are that it includes both the direct radiative and indirect cloud forming effects of the aerosols, and also includes aerosol dynamics, physics, and chemistry to the fullest extent possible in the model. However, because aerosol cloud interactions are so uncertain and are present across huge time and spatial scales, you have to deal with all of that uncertainty in your model. So another thing that you could do is you could modify what is called the cloud droplet number concentration, or CDNC, in your model. And rather than simulating the injection of sea salt, you simply go into the cloud physics code and you turn up effectively the cloud brightness by saying that there's an increase to the number of cloud droplets that are actually there. And you only are going to capture the indirect effects from this. You're going to miss out on the direct radiative effects of the aerosols, as well as the aerosol dynamics, physics, and chemistry. It does bypass the aerosol cloud interaction uncertainty. So in that sense, you could argue that it's sort of a cleaner representation of this aspect of the physics. But of course, you're then introducing new uncertainties because cloud parameterization suites and models are very carefully tuned in order to reproduce observed results in the real world. And so by going and messing with that parameter suite, you're introducing additional uncertainties that would not be present with the sea salt injection method. So at the current state of the research, I would not argue that one of these methods is especially better than the other. I think that it is possible that there are experiments we can do in climate models using both of these different methods to learn more about how marine cloud brightening would manifest itself and impact the Earth system. The other question is, what reasons are chosen for cloud seeding? The first method that you could do is you could just draw a box on the ocean grid somewhere. You say what your desired region is. You bound it by latitudes and longitudes. And then you apply your seeding scheme, whether it's sea salt or CDNC perturbation, inside those boxes. Another option is you could go by susceptibility. You could figure out inside your climate model, if you brighten certain clouds or spray sea salt into certain clouds, which areas of your model demonstrate the largest change in shortwave forcing due to clouds. So you could choose the regions based on that instead. Or you could simply choose to seed everywhere. Some experiments have chosen to seed all of the ocean grid cells for between two latitudes. You could say we're going to do this cloud seeding everywhere in the tropics in the model. Or some even do everywhere on the planet and try and learn something from that. And so with that in mind, I'd like to talk about a few specific studies, which I think together do a pretty good job of describing the design space of marine cloud brightening and what we know about our options for choosing where and how to seed if marine cloud brightening were ever to be deployed. I'd like to start from the beginning. This is, from what I can tell, the first numerical experiments of marine cloud brightening, which were published by John Latham and company in the Royal Society Journal in 2008. And what John Latham wanted to do is he wanted to basically pioneer the susceptibility method. He used a numerical model called HADGAM, which is from the Hadley Center. I believe it's a precursor to the present day Hadley Center Earth System model. And what he did is he applied a method where he would adjust the cloud droplet number concentration for every grid cell of the oceans for the entire planet in order to figure out where are the most susceptible regions for cloud seeding in the model. And so what he found were that those regions tended to be in the tropical Pacific in the summer hemisphere. So on the left, we have Northern Hemisphere winter, December, January, February. On the right, we have June, July, August. And then the top row represents the 5% most susceptible regions in this model. And the bottom row represents the top 25%. And if you integrate over all of these regions, Latham produced a figure like this. And specifically, what I want to direct your attention to is this thin, solid black line, which represents year-round seeding, so both the summer and the winter seasons. And you're setting the cloud droplet number concentration to 375. And the magnitude of forcing that most model experiments go for is on the order of 2 to 2.5 watts per meter squared of forcing. And in this experiment, Latham concluded that you would need on the order of about 20% of the ocean to be seeded in this manner in order to cool the planet by the desired amount. And so the takeaways from this study are that you would need about 15 to 20% coverage to produce 2 to 2.5 watts per meter squared of forcing. However, this is a highly idealized method. Other studies have shown that it would be very difficult to bring all of these regions to a value of 375 simultaneously. And also something I wanted to point out is that the value of 375 droplets per cubic centimeter was chosen by the authors seemingly arbitrarily. The paper only says that it's their opinion that this would be an achievable value in the real world, but doesn't go beyond that. And several future papers, including ones that I am a co-author on, cite this original study of 375 being sort of a valid target number for cloud droplet number concentration in seeded clouds. But this paper doesn't really provide any concrete evidence to back that up. And so I just wanted to mention that because it's something I'm looking at that I'll talk about in a little bit. So Latham et al. Did not actually simulate what the effects of this cloud seeding scheme would be in a model, but Latham worked with another modeler, Philip Resch, the next year to put a paper into environmental research letters that actually tested this scheme. So what they did was they used the community climate system model, a modified version of version 3 of that model, which I believe is a predecessor to NCAR's community Earth system model. And they used a scenario where with doubled CO2 concentrations, they ran the model for 100 years, and they would use the same CDNC method as Latham, and they would seed the top 20, 30, 40, and 70% of the susceptible gray boxes in their model, and then determine what would the actual impacts on the Earth system be. So Latham predicted that you would need to seed about 20%, and Rasch and company found that the simulation in which they seeded 20% of the ocean surface area provided about 1 degree of cooling. However, if we look at a map of that cooling, we can see that the most heavily cooled areas are going to be in the seeded regions in tropical and subtropical Pacific, and that there are other regions of the globe which are not cooled very much and are still warmer than the control temperature. And if we look at the precipitation maps that Rasch published in their paper, we see that there's pretty large disruption to tropical precipitation in the Pacific Ocean. So the main takeaways from this first climate model study are that they used the same value of 375, which is something I just want to point out. They used about 20% coverage was sufficient to offset about 1 degree of global warming. And there was some regional disparity in the temperature and precipitation responses. So I'd like to jump forward to a few years now and talk about some of the first intermodal comparisons of marine cloud brightening. Ben Kravitz, who was one of the leads of the Geoengineering Model Intercomparison Project, or GeoMIP, for a couple of years, published an experimental protocol in JGR atmospheres in 2013. And the experiment I'd like to focus on was called G4CDNC. And the parameters of the experiment were he eventually got a whopping 9 models to participate, which I think is really, really cool. They would use, by this point, the RCP scenarios had been developed. And so the experimental protocol called for the RCP 4.5 moderate warming scenario. And rather than setting cloud droplet number concentration to a fixed value, the protocol called for an increase in the current CDNC in every grid cell by 50% of whatever it was before marine cloud brightening. And the protocol called for you to do this in every grid cell in the world that was covered in ocean. And while this is somewhat unrealistic, it provides a relatively simple, idealized framework for multiple models to participate. And the results were published 5 years later in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics. And if we look at the temperature change averaged over all of the different participating models, we see that the cooling that you get is relatively uniform across different longitudes. And this is in contrast to the Phil Rash study from 2009, which focused the cooling on a smaller area of the ocean, and the results were more regionally disparate. So this is going to become a recurring theme in my talk today, that broadly speaking, the experiments which try to cool the entire planet by seeding relatively small areas of the ocean have very disparate and heterogeneous regional impacts in temperature and precipitation, whereas the experiments which try to cool larger fractions of the globe have a more uniform cooling response. There was another study published in 2013 by Altsger et al. In JGR Atmospheres, which did a similar experiment, which they called G3SSCE, which I think stands for Sea Salt Climate Engineering. And this was a 3 Earth system model comparison between IPSEL, which is the Laplace Institute in France, MPI is the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and NORISM is the Norwegian Earth system model. And they used the same setup as Kravitz et al., except instead of the CDNC method, they would call for sea salt to be injected everywhere between 30 north and 30 south. And if we look at the surface response, we see again that the amount of the cooling distribution that we get is relatively uniform. And so, but there's they also talked about the differences between the models. And in particular, they talked about how much sea salt would be needed to implement the amount of cooling in the models. And so by the 2060 to 2070 period, there is a huge discrepancy, about a factor of 2, in how much sea salt is actually needed to produce the desired amount of cooling. And additionally, while I am not an expert on the sort of engineering aspects of climate engineering, 560 teragrams of sea salt per year seems to be a staggeringly large number. There is not a huge amount of literature on at least that I'm aware of, about the actual logistics of using things like ships. But Stephen Salter wrote a companion paper in 2008 for Latham's paper, and using his methodology, the authors of this paper estimated that you would need a fleet of about 16,000 vessels in order to maintain this injection rate. And so the takeaways from here are that when the intervention area is larger, a result that we're going to see over and over again is that you have a more even distribution of cooling than when the injection area is smaller. However, for these particular experiments, you need huge quantities of sea salt, and there's also a very large intermodal spread of how much you need to inject. And so with that, I'd like to jump to the present day and talk about some more recent studies. The first study that I'd like to talk about is by Jack Chen, who is my supervisor at NCAR. He was an author on both the original Latham and Rash papers, and this was the first paper that I joined in on. And joining on this study is the reason that I eventually ended up as a postdoc at NCAR. Jack wanted to revisit the susceptibility experiments that Latham did in 2008, and except he wanted to do it using the newer version of the community Earth system model. And so he used the new SSP scenarios, and he used the same cloud droplet number concentration method as Latham did about 15 years ago. And again, he created seeding maps for to determine where are the most susceptible regions on the planet. Rather than just doing seeding maps for the summer and the winter, he created seeding maps for every different month. So on this figure, the red and the pink are the most susceptible regions where if you perturb the cloud droplet number concentration, you get the largest changes in radiative forcing. And then as you expand your map, you get into the yellow and green, and eventually the blue areas round out the top 20%. However, you'll recall from Latham's experiments that he found that you need about 20% of ocean area in order to get 2 to 2.5 watts per meter squared of forcing. But what Jack found in CESM2 was very different. In order to get this level of forcing in CESM2, you'd only need to seed about 5% of the ocean surface area, which was a big change from what Latham found about 15 years ago. And so Jack did simulations where he seeded 2.5, 5, 7.5, and 12.5% of the ocean surface area in this model, and found that indeed the 5% seeding map is the one that gets you about 1 degree of cooling, which is what he was sort of looking for as a target in this study. And because we're seeding an even smaller area of the ocean than Latham and Rasch did about 15 years ago, we see huge heterogeneity in the surface response in both temperature and precipitation. So we have as much as 4 to 5 degrees of cooling in the seeding area, and then due to cloud and circulation changes, the MCB causes substantial warming of about the same magnitude in some other regions of the globe, and precipitation is also very much altered in the tropics in the Pacific. And so the main takeaways that we can get from this study are that CESM2 shows a very strong response to Marine Cloud Brightening, which was much higher than Latham's estimates. And you only need to seed about 5% of the oceans in this model to get 1 degree of cooling. And the surface conditions strongly resemble a very strong La Nina-like event. And from the other climate scientists that I have talked to, this is seen as a very negative result, and this is not an impact that you would want to create in the real world. Other recent studies include a study by Jim Haywood and other folks from the UK that was published last year, and they did some simulations of MCB in their UK ESM climate model. And what they did is they used an old G6 setup where they use the high warming SSP 5.8.5 scenario, and they try and use sea salt to bring the global mean temperature back down to the equivalent states in a moderate warming scenario. And they did this using the box method. So they picked out specific regions where in the Pacific Ocean, where marine cloud brightening had specifically been focused on, because these regions are seen as susceptible to cloud perturbations. And then by injecting sea salt in these boxes, they compared the results in their Earth system model to other simulations of stratospheric aerosol injection and then high and medium global warming. And so the main takeaways here are that while they were able to bring the global average temperature to the desired state, there was overcooling in the Pacific. The temperature, the color bar on the graphs in their paper is pretty extreme. It goes all the way up to 25 K. But this light shade of blue in the Pacific does correspond to as much as 2 to 2.5 degrees of cooling. And you get undercooling in North America and other parts of the Pacific. And this pattern is similar, though not nearly as strong, to what we saw in Jack's study in CESM2, where if you can confine your seeding to the Pacific Ocean, you're going to tend to overcool that area and undercool or even warm other parts of the planet. Another study I want to talk about is from, let's see, I've got about 5 minutes left, which should be enough time. This is a study that Phil Rasch is working on, and it was released as a preprint this year. And what Phil did is Dr. Rasch wanted to compare a similar study to the Haywood study that I just talked about, but comparing across climate models. And so this study considers CESM2 as well as E3SM and UK ESM. And in the SSP245 scenario, they injected sea salt with the goal of producing about 2 watts per meter squared of globally average radiative forcing. And they also used the box method. They used the same 4 boxes as the Haywood study, and then added 2 more of their own, one in the Southeast Atlantic and one in the Northern Oceans. And so this is a lot of graphs on the screen right now. I'd like to start by drawing your attention to the top of the figure, where it shows the average injection rates for each of the 3 models. And you'll see that, again, there's a huge intermodal discrepancy where CESM is very susceptible and required only 2.5 teragrams of sea salt per year. But E3SM needed about 5 times that, and UK ESM needed about 20 times that. Additionally, if we look at the regional responses, they are particularly strong in CESM2 compared to the other 2 models. But we see that you're going to get most of the cooling where you deploy the intervention, and undercool or even warm other parts of the planet. And especially if we look at the precipitation responses, even in E3SM and UKESM, which have a weaker response than CESM, most of the boxes still influence tropical precipitation in a big way. And so, however, they also did another experiment where they noticed, if you look at the top 3 lines of the first graph, which are Northeast Pacific, Southeast Pacific, and Southeast Atlantic, the authors observed that the temperature responses here in some ways tend to cancel each other out. And so they did another experiment where they seeded these 3 regions at once in CESM2 and E3SM. And we can see that especially in E3SM, the temperature response looks a bit more uniform. And so the takeaways that I get from this study are that, firstly, the box method is extremely useful for intermodal comparison. And secondly, some boxes have strong regional responses, but there's a possibility for a more uniform response if you seed multiple boxes simultaneously. Now, the last study that I want to talk about today is another study that Jack just published in Geophysical Research Letters. And
please?
They might be away from the computer. Ron, thank you. So after his first study where he saw that seeding just the tropical and subtropical Pacific caused very large regional impacts, Jack wanted to revisit the susceptibility study, but from a different perspective. So he used the same model, the same scenario, the same methodology, except when choosing where to seed, Jack asked himself, why do we have to focus on the top part of this susceptibility curve? There is no reason why it is mandatory that we start with the most susceptible grid cells and work our way down. We can ignore this part at the bottom where the forcing is positive, but what if we looked at this portion of the seeding curve over here, where the marginal forcing that you get is less, and so you could seed larger areas of the ocean to get the same total radiative forcing. And so Jack generated new seeding maps where the red seeding maps are the old 5% seeding maps from his previous study. And the blue seeding maps correspond to this area that is highlighted down in the bottom left, corresponding to the least susceptible 30% of the ocean by surface area. And you'll notice that while most of the red patches are in the tropical and subtropical Pacific, most of the blue patches are in the winter hemisphere and in the mid-latitudes or even the subpolar regions. And when Jack simulated the setup using CESM2, the figure on the left is from the 5% seeding strategy, but the figure on the right has a very, very uniform temperature map. And so the takeaways that we got from this study are that even in a model like CESM2, where the sensitivity to marine cloud brightening is very large compared to other models, using this seeding strategy, there is a much more uniform temperature response, and notably, there was no La Nina-like pattern in the Pacific. However, this also introduces other logistical and scientific questions. The reason why most of the MCB studies so far have focused on the Pacific is because that's where there are big stratocumulus cloud decks that are susceptible to salt spray. And there are the scientific questions of how one could brighten the clouds at high latitudes in the winter hemisphere are different. And additionally, those regions are further away from heavily populated areas, and it would probably be more logistically difficult in order to seed those areas. So I have just a minute or two to wrap up. So I'd like to conclude by asking, after looking at all of these different studies, what is the best global MCB strategy? We've looked at several different methods where people use boxes, grid cells ranked by susceptibility, or just seed everywhere. And when answering this question, I'm going to talk about both the Earth system impacts and the modeling benefits or challenges. When it comes to the box method, we have a very high scientific understanding. We can focus on desired regions and even combine them, and it's very useful for intermodal comparison. But if you're only seeding one box, you get strong regional heterogeneity in the response, especially in certain models like CESM2. If you focus on only the most susceptible regions of the ocean, you're going to get the strongest cooling, which means it's probably going to be the cheapest, and you're going to have you're focusing on the the stratocumulus cloud decks, which means we have a high scientific understanding compared to other parts of the ocean. But the simulations are likely highly idealized, which is both a pro and a con. And of course, we see that strong La Nina-like response in the Pacific, especially in CESN2. On the other hand, you could see the least susceptible parts of the ocean, which gives you a very even cooling response. However, these simulations are also very idealized, and there are significant logistical and scientific uncertainties at this stage, even compared to the other methods of marine cloud brightening. And lastly, the options to see everywhere also tend towards a more even cooling response, and they're very good for intermodal comparison. However, there are likely also enormous logistical constraints in terms of the number of vessels and the amount of salt you would need, and that introduces complications in itself. So in summary, my analysis of the current state of the research is that there's a trade-off between questions like, can we learn a lot from model experiments? Would we actually want to do this in real life? And would it be feasible to do this in real life? And so in my opinion, there is no single best method of, oh, can I go back? No, I cannot. There is no single best method of marine cloud brightening modeling at this stage of the research. And so I had a few more slides in case time went over, talking about my current work with feedback algorithms, but I think we can skip that. I also want to thank Alan Gadian, who sent me these really cool plots for a study that he's working on. I didn't have a good place to squeeze them in, but it looks like he's also doing a sort of box method where he uses numerical analysis to see how different seeding patterns in different parts of the globe can affect individual grid boxes. And I just think that's really cool and demonstrates that we are still evolving in how we tackle the problem. So that's a good place to wrap up for today. So thank you, everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about any other, discuss any details in further, if you would.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Walker. Robert, can we stop the sharing, or Alan? I'm sorry, Walker. Yeah, great. Okay. Wow, that was a lot. You packed in a lot of really substantive information there and analysis. Why is oh, there we go. Okay, so our normal procedure is people just raise their hand as Brian just did, and we'll try and keep the order. Robert, could you keep track of the order? And we just go at it. I mean, at some point I may use my moderator's prerogative to interject a question of my own, but let's just, we have a lot of people here who are quite knowledgeable. Especially, I think Alan is on somewhere. There he is. Yeah, so if at some point, if we run out of times, we will probably give some preference to the more expert among us on this particular topic. But for now, let's just go in order. So, Brian, it's all yours.
Yes, thank you, Ron. And Walker, thank you for this great presentation, kind of looking at all the modeling that's been done on a global level to understand global aspects for a global intervention. You asked a very interesting question at the end, and that is, what is the best approach or good starting approaches? And I would like to ask you whether you've seen any research on local and coastal approaches to help communities, to help locales and regions, as opposed to trying to go large scale. I'd be interested in any research that may be coming along on the local and coastal approach with community acceptance.
So that's a great question, because my talk today was mainly about the global scale, and I know that there's a lot of people working on local scale. I know that there's, for instance, people in Australia are looking at trying to protect the Great Barrier Reef. There are definitely studies that look at that. I am less familiar with them than I am with the global scale ones, because my research has focused on global scale. And as such, I think that other people in this call would almost certainly be better equipped to answer questions about those kind of studies. I will say that because of some of the impacts that I talked about today, where focusing on smaller regions tends to give you disparate impacts, I would say that I am inclined to be skeptical that a regional intervention could give you enough cooling to result in meaningful impacts without also causing problems somewhere nearby. However, that is just sort of my gut reaction, and I would be happy to be proven wrong by people who could point me to studies that show otherwise.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, no, I think the jury's out. I think we need to do some small scale trials and really identify, the potential opportunities and effects. So I think there's probably some good modeling work. Be interested in understanding that better. Thanks.
Rebecca's next.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I think we usually, our rule is kind of one follow-up, but just to avoid having extensive dialogues. But we sometimes break that if we get some very intense expertise kind of discussion going on. But anyway, Rebecca.
Hi, Walker. I'm down in Sydney, Australia, and I really wanted to say thank you so much for a very accessible, technically oriented presentation. I'm probably classed myself as about a second-year undergrad in this area, and I have the pleasure of working with Alan in the Rebrighton group, and I do appreciate all the hard work you put in. And it's more of a comment, I suppose, that I think the kind of work that you've done today is going to be very important when socialising this work or the idea of this particular strategy, MCB, with communities, to be able to highlight them to the controversies and methodologies. Like the biggest thing is the cloud aerosol dynamics and also logistics. But I do want to say thank you, because we're all trying to think of how to make this accessible if any communities would like to participate. And I did ask you beforehand to talk about the meaning of it all, and so you certainly have answered that question, and we do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you found the presentation accessible. So thank you for sharing that. That's really good feedback.
Okay,
Robert, who's next? What's the
yes,
queue?
I'm next. So then we've
Okay,
got
go ahead.
after me, it's Robert, Chris, Sev Clark, and Clive Ellsworth. So thanks, Walker. That was just awesome. It really opened, like, for example, I'm interested in the idea of seeding. I'm in Australia, and if we seeded in the Southern Ocean, in the south of the Indian Ocean, that's listed as a region that's not particularly susceptible, but might have benefits for Australia. So that's a question. But what I want to ask you about was, you commented that there's some people who say never do it, and some do it maybe sometime in the next 50 years. And I'm more of the line of thinking, do it as fast as we possibly can, because I feel that the risk of climate tipping points, such as the AMOC circulation and the collapse of Arctic sea ice, just so severe that it's like, when you go to hospital, they don't say, oh, we'll just wait a couple of days before we do emergency surgery. It's like I just feel that the planet is in this emergency situation, and I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
It's a good question, and I guess that's kind of the question that we're all trying to answer by being in this meeting today. That ultimately, that's going to come down to a value judgment of whether you think that the risks of climate change are more severe or the risks of climate intervention are more severe. And then there's also the issues of things like of representation and democratic decision making. I would say that while I am perhaps confident that I think at this point in the research, I would say it is more likely than not, in my opinion, that some method of climate intervention is likely going to be less risky and more beneficial than not doing some kind of climate intervention at some point in the not so distant future. I don't think we're ready to go out and start deploying today, because of the huge, especially with Marine Cloud Brightening, because of the huge disparities between models that we see in some of these studies, and also the current state of the actual engineering research in terms of what is the right particle size to deploy? Can we reliably generate that particle size? And under what conditions do we spray it into clouds in order to make them brighter? I'm not sure we can answer those questions confidently enough that I would say we should try and go out and deploy a climate intervention today. So that's sort of my answer to the
that's very clear that there needs to be work on modeling and advocacy and generation as the next steps before deployment is possible. But I'm just looking at issues, especially extreme weather and sea level rise and biodiversity loss and systemic disruptions. You know, they seem to me the just major problems in a context where the likelihood of emission reduction is really very low. So if we accept that emission reduction is just too difficult, then we have to do direct climate cooling in order to prevent catastrophe.
I'm not going to say that you're wrong. I think I just have a different value judgment in terms of how I look at the risks of climate intervention compared to just looking at some of the plots we've seen on the studies that I presented on today. I think it's possible that climate intervention could cause more harm than good in some parts of the world, and I just think we need to understand that better before we can go out and actually do it. Especially if it's just a small number of people trying to make the decision. I feel that representation and democratic input into whatever decisions are being made, even if our system as a global society is imperfect, I think it's important too that decisions are being made by lots of people and not just a small number of people.
Absolutely, completely agree. And so governance, like some sort of international albedo union that would determine how to do this in a participatory way that brings social acceptance. I'll leave it at that, Walker, and hand on to Robert Chris.
Yeah, hi. That was just a great presentation. Just bear with me 1 second. I just realized my battery is going down. I need to plug it in. Right. Yeah, that was a great presentation. Lots of stuff there. I just want to really pick up. It's a follow-on from the question that Robert Tulip just asked you. I'm also very focused on the urgency question here. And it seems to me that there is a kind of potential trade-off between getting this stuff out there to benefit the humanity by if you like, reducing climate risks through some form of climate intervention on the one hand, and the factoring into that the logistics, the sheer engineering. You made some references, for example, that the most, if you like, benign way, the best way of getting the most even cooling was to do the thing right across the globe. But of course, this involved vast amounts of resources. So
I will cut in real quick and just say that my numbers on that may have been wrong. Alan left a bunch of comments in the chat, and I would absolutely defer to anyone else's opinion on these matters, especially people who are actually authors on the papers in question that I was talking about. So my reporting on that may not have been perfect, but I think in the principle was still correct that a wider area, of course, you need more vessels. Sorry, please continue.
Now, the question I want to get to, Walker, is that do we need some kind of metric or some kind of process that is continuously measuring the logistical feasibility of these various interventions, proposed interventions, against their climatic efficacy? Because it may well be that the most climatically effective and efficacious solution is not the most logistically feasible one, and that we might have to accept something that is good rather than something that's perfect. And I'm conscious that, you know, from an academic perspective, when you're doing this research, you're constantly looking for the best outcome, and it may well be that that's not what we need, the best outcome. We need just a good enough outcome.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, I agree with the point that you raised, and I think it's well taken. I am not aware of many people who are working on this. In terms of stratospheric aerosol injection, there is a fellow called Wake Smith at Yale who is a former flight director at Boeing, and he's a really great guy. I've worked with him a couple times, and he looks at the logistics for for stratospheric aerosol injection, and the trade-off specifically between things like higher altitude, which would get you longer aerosol lifetime, versus the additional cost you would need to build aircraft capable of lofting the aerosols to that higher level. I'm not aware of any marine cloud brightening studies that compare different strategies like that in a way that is sort of comparing a good enough, cheaper strategy to a excellent but much more expensive strategy. And I think that someone should absolutely go out and do that. If there are figures out there for how much it would cost to make these vessels and how many of them we could build and how quickly, and we could do a comparison, that seems incredibly useful. But I'm not aware of the prerequisite research being in place in order to do something like that. I think that's probably the most I could say on the matter right now.
Thank you, Walker. I'd like to jump to Alan if we can, just because I think it would get if Seb and Clive could excuse me, I'll get to you. But I think it would be good to have another expert point of view presented. Go ahead, Alan.
Lee, you present some interesting questions and arguments and discussions. And we can argue about whether it's 5% or 25% of the surface, but we did the calculations. The first point I would make, I'd like to point out with Robbie as well, that the question of timing is, if you look at the results of modern models, now we're talking about high resolution models. So recently, there's a paper come out by the head of all the major meteorological organizations: Max Planck, Peter Boyer, Tim Palmer, Graham Stevens, Bjorn Stevens, George Schucht, all around the world, saying we need a kilometer model. And the reason is because the precipitation patterns from all the climate models are totally wrong. You've got a meter in error of rainfall in the large areas of the globe, the models. So there is a real problem that the models we're using are totally, which you basically said that. So I'm agreeing with you, but saying it even more, that the problem with looking at the errors, so you do point that out, and that's really good. There's a lot of questions. I mean, Latham and Co. and I did some more work. The figures on salt injection is really quite interesting because there's papers, and it depends on the numbers you use. But the biggest thing that's happened in the past year that we're battling with, Ron as well, is that there's been this huge change of 0.24 degrees C warming in 1 year. Rob Wood, all sorts of people. And that has just come from changing the emissions from ship stacks. And my big fear is that in the models are so poor that the increase in temperature increases the water vapor, and the water vapor, I'm not worried about CO2 now. So what I worry about is the fact that the models do not get the water vapor. So while we have to use them, I think one has to be cautious. So the precipitation patterns, that I think you're right, we have to do a lot more. The reason the 3-area seeding was done, and it was only 5 or 10%, whatever, was, and Jack's, I see Jack's on the line as well, or maybe on the line, was to do this. And we did it as a simple way of looking at it. Now, the problem with the GeoMIP ones, and there's a lot of paleontologists around the globe saying, this is fantastic what they're doing, but it's wrong. So I have always said to Stephen Salter and people that we have to do an experiment. And that's exactly what we did this year with the emissions. And so to me, you've not said anything that is not upsetting. I still think that there's a lot to do. They didn't mention the small scale modeling. So people like Graham Feingold, who's just down the road, all these other people, Rob Wood. So when you say 375, there is a reason for that, but I'm not going into it. It was a microphysics reason. So in that way, you might have been a bit disingenuous, but I think you've presented a lot of things for people to talk about. But I really would, all these to emphasize that these models are very bad. And when you get people like Slingo, Bates, Spoyers, Belcher, Palmer, Stevens, whose heads climate, NASA, Stockard, Schutz, these guys are saying we cannot believe these models. And what's happened in India, the ECS, that's the climate sensitivity, double CO2, has now gone up to 8 degrees, not 6 degrees. So there is an urgency. And I would say that I would agree with Robbie there. We've got 5 years. That's all. And maybe on the model results don't give that, but 5 years. And if you talk to senior people in the EU, they're not worried about the temperature. They're worried about the AMOC, which again, someone raised. And they're worried the AMOC will collapse, which will be catastrophic for Northern Europe because it's a 10-degree temperature drop. So there's huge, and the sea surface. So yes, it's great what you're doing. We need a lot more of it, but I must admit, I don't agree with some of it, but that's fine. But the emphasis on smaller scale models and observations is absolutely critical. So that's what I'd please. That's what we've got to do more.
Thank you. I really appreciate the perspective. Like I said, I've only been in the marine cloud brightening industry for about a year now. And as such, I really appreciate talking to different people and hearing what they have to say. In particular, the idea of a higher resolution model is something that's come up a lot recently. And at NCAR, that might be something that we have the computational capabilities to look into. So that's something that I can. I
think you need a 15 gigawatt power station to do it. And there can only be, NCAR hasn't got the facilities to do it. I mean, you're talking about something that's an order of magnitude bigger. And it has to be, there's only, but anyway, these are what these guys are saying. You've got to have
Microsoft's building that 15 gigawatts and they're going to do it with AI, but you can use it for large climate and fine climate models as well.
You can't do AI with this because AI is great for 5 days. When you go into a new situation,
the computing capacity of the supercomputing cluster will enable climate modeling that is fundamental. And the point is that computing resource is being built as we speak, designed and built.
They've spent $2 billion on a machine 10 miles away from me, and it won't do it. It's too small.
No. The point is you've got the computational capacity to do the high-res models, and that's coming, and we should plan for it.
Well, but we'll hope you're right, Brian. Walker, did you have more to say on this, or we can move on?
I think we can move on. I don't think I could contribute anything else.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Alan. And let me just do a speaker's prerogative here, just for 1 second. I imagine maybe Sev or Clive may be thinking of similar to what I'm going to say. We have in our cooling paper that has just been accepted for publication by Oxford Open Climate Change. We are proposing a sort of a gradual, gradual strategy of starting local, and just trying things. Just doing it a little bit, seeing what happens. Like, I mean, the Great Barrier Reef is a great example. I mean, they're trying to do it. They see, and perhaps it won't have, I mean, even if it has a little bit of cooling, that might be enough to help some of those coral reefs, because they're very susceptible to the really, really high, the extreme events. And if you can just lop off a little bit of the extreme event, you might be able to save some coral reefs. So I think, I guess I'm sort of in line with a lot of that just kind of local efforts to try things and measure them, kind of empirical approach. And the same for SAI, by the way, is that, Walker, you may be familiar, the polar strategy, try to save the poles and so anyway, that might be another sort of approach. Jack, if you want to chime in here at any point, please, we would welcome your input as well. And I'll move on with that to Sev.
Walker, I noticed that the blanket coverage in any one ocean tended to have bad results. Have you considered, think of a chessboard put across the whole world, and we're only doing MCB in the white squares, and then maybe say, well, instead of only 1 in 2 squares, we might do it in only 1 in 6 or 1 in 20 squares. Do the models allow you to have, say, 400 stations scattered across the oceans of the world roughly evenly, and having the MCB occurring just in those spots, but not in the numbers immediately around those things? Wouldn't that solve the logistics problem and give you your more even spread of MCB?
It's an interesting idea. It's not something that I've looked at personally, but it's the model would certainly have, we would certainly have the capability to do that. So yes, that's definitely a direction that one could go. And I don't know what it would look like. We would have to try it.
Beauty. Do so.
Clive?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I don't know where to call Walker Lee. Yes, thank you very much. Wonderful. What so I work with people on how can you make aerosol particles the right size, and you can mix gases and make ammonium chloride particles pretty much as small as you want. Do you know? But I don't see anything much. You know, there's lots of great stuff about models. Obviously, we need better. You know, Alan Gaddian just said we got 5 years, but then when someone wants to do an experiment, like from an aircraft carrier, it gets closed down. I mean, do you know of anyone who's produced a sea salt aerosol that's brightened a cloud somewhere? I mean, I know that volcanoes. Jim Hayward said, no, you don't. So no one's actually done it yet.
Not to my knowledge. Yeah, I think the aircraft carrier, the Hornet experiment off the coast of California, I think they were able to run it for a little bit before it got shut down. So they might have some data from that experiment. I am not privy to it right now, but no, I mean, besides satellite photos of ship tracks, I have no knowledge of any experiments in real world conditions that brighten clouds with sea salt.
Can I just ask one more follow-up very briefly? So therefore, the experiment that has been done in the opposite way around is sulfur dioxide. I'm not saying that's necessarily a great idea, but has anyone done any modeling of marine cloud brightening with sulfur dioxide? Or is anyone thinking about doing
Yes. Oh, marine cloud brightening with sulfur. Sorry, I was thinking of sulfur dioxide as stratospheric aerosol injection. I do not have any knowledge in that area. It's possible someone's looked at it. I do not know.
I think the UK Met Office are doing the experiment now, or they said they were doing the ship tracks and running for a year at 4 kilometers with and without the sulfur emissions from the ships. Now, that's taken a lot of effort to get them to agree to do that. Much bigger people than me, but yeah, there is an experiment ongoing.
Excellent, thank you.
Brian, your hand is still up. Do you want to?
Yeah, let's see.
Right.
I'm glad that Clive mentioned volcanic effects, because there's a recent paper by Leeds University just in the last month or two that really studied the tropospheric volcanic aerosols off Hawaii and Iceland, and their effects, because there's a great example of a natural aerosol and their effects downwind. And what's notable was that they saw a significant increase in cloud fraction under human conditions, and not much on the brightness side. Now, you mentioned on your modeling that at least one of the studies was just look at cloud brightness, but I'm wondering if cloud fraction might be a more appropriate metric going forward, and to what extent either or both of those models really accommodates this cloud fraction effect that's now been observed in nature.
So cloud fraction is definitely, so when presenting the results today, I'm mainly focused on temperature maps, but in the studies that I pulled these figures from, a lot of them had graphs that included changes to various aspects of the cloud physics, including cloud fraction. So I would say, yes, that is something that people who run the studies are looking at. And it's something that I'm looking at now in Jack's most recent simulations of the tail 30% seeding maps, because the sensitivity of the model to the particular seeding map changes over time, and we think that changes to cloud fraction are responsible for that within the model. So
Okay.
Yes.
Right. And just as a quick follow-up, I think you mentioned the question about regional effects, and I think it's important to recognize that our observational data from the Ceres satellite and the NASA Big Bear Solar Observatory have indicated actually a loss of marine cloud brightness in certain regions on the coastlines. And so thus just restoring marine cloud brightness to levels that were even 20 years ago would be a first opportunity, and that kind of getting back to pre-industrial levels, I think could help to build social acceptance. So I think there is something to be said for local and coastal approaches that work to
Certainly
pre-industrial levels.
Can I just add, Brian, that the paper you're referring to was produced in Nature Geoscience, April 2024, and it's by Chen. And this is the one that's come out and said substantial cooling effect of aerosol induced increase in tropical marine boundary layer. But the paper is very recently available. I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, thanks so much. Back to you.
Okay, thank you, Walker. We usually go till around the top of the hour here, till I guess if that's okay with you. I don't want to okay, Robert.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Walker, if you could talk a bit more about the concept of teleconnection. So I noticed in some of the recent literature the idea that if marine cloud brightening was just deployed in the North Pacific Ocean, then it could actually have a warming effect on the Atlantic Ocean, and so could slow down the AMOC. So this is obviously something that comes out of your the whole modeling research area, and would you be able to expand on that?
Maybe a little bit. I am aware of a pretty cool paper by Jessica Wan that was, I believe, published pretty recently, where they use targeted marine cloud brightening to dampen the severity of a very strong El Nino effect. And there is growing evidence that where teleconnections exist within the Earth system, where known teleconnections exist, you can, if you deploy an intervention at one sort of end of the teleconnection, that you can affect the other aspects of it. Sort of like a domino effect, where if there's a chain of dominoes that we are aware of, if you mess with one part of the chain, you can mess with other parts of the chain. I'm not very familiar with the ins and outs of those studies. I just know that they exist, and there's a body of evidence that suggests that it's possible to sort of engineer teleconnections in this way. And also in a lot of the plots that we saw from the model experiments that I shared today, there were a lot of the impacts, the strong precipitation changes that we saw, and sometimes the temperature changes that we saw, were not in the area that you were seeding itself, but sometimes well removed from it. So I would say that this is definitely worth looking into more, but I can't comment on it very intelligently right now.
So it really challenges the concept of local MCB, because, for example, it may be that if Europe wanted to improve the Gulf Stream and protect the Gulf Stream and just do local MCB to reduce extreme storm intensity in the Atlantic, then that might have negative effects on other regions of the world. And so it's really it illustrates the extent to which climate is a global problem, and so there's this need for a governance arrangement to enable people to come together at a global level to just, I suppose, start with activities and learn by doing, and just recognize the need for a global approach.
Thank you, Robert. I don't know, Walker. It sounds like you're expressing agreement.
I'm broadly in agreement. I think that is that those particular responses that we've seen in climate models are why I am somewhat skeptical of localized MCB interventions, because if you have an intervention that is large enough to be influential and or detectable, are you going to affect some other aspect of the planet? And is it going to be what you think it's going to be? And I'm not sure how confidently we can answer that question as of right now.
Right.
Can I just add that I've put 2 papers in the chat there that you might like to download without paying for them. I shouldn't say that. but there are 2 PDFs there that they charge money for. That one is by Slingo and one is this recent paper. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Alan. So let me, I would like, if I could, since no one else is in the queue right now, just to expand a little bit on my earlier point. So I understand and agree with your concern about adverse effects. That is, it's not, the problem is if we do an intervention and instead of helping, we end up harming by doing, that appears in your modeling from significant local cooling that could, have adverse effects elsewhere. I think what the approach that I was kind of suggesting was that some of the Great Barrier Reef effort, if you were able to do the local cooling that was not, 1 degree C or even half a degree C, but just, moderating the really extreme heat events, that, and it would be fairly temporary as well, just applied during those periods, that might get around, so I would sort of, I think what I was trying to do is encourage, saying that, we should probably support those kind of efforts, and, because they don't appear to be the kind of things that could result in these kind of globally effects elsewhere. So, is that something? Because in our cooling paper, we suggest, we need, one or more very large major global, well, we highlight 3 direct climate cooling methods that have potentially that are globally scalable within the short period, like the next 10 or 20 years. And because we are focusing on the urgent need for cooling, and we highlight the 3 stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, and tropospheric aerosol injection, that is what Clive is working on, as potential candidates. And then a bunch of others, like 11 other, that could have local and regional effects for these, particularly to help with the extreme situations that I'm talking about. And so, marine cloud brightening would certainly, it appears to be a candidate for that. And because of that kind of approach, we're saying, let's get on with it. Let's start trying these things, and then we'll also get a better understanding of what the actual impacts are, and we'll get the issues with the modeling will perhaps be less important. So or at least we'll have a better handle. We'll have better models. We can calibrate them better and hopefully get more accurate. Because one of the problems with the recent huge jump, as I understand it, is that it was not predicted by the climate models. That this kind of thing, I think it's outside of 2 standard deviations or something, way out of the kind of predictions. I'm talking about the global, average global surface temperatures. That is unprecedented. It just has not happened, and therefore folks have pointed to, as I'm sure Jim Hansen and colleagues and other, and I think I don't want to Alan would know more about this than me, but that it could very well be that reverse geoengineering experiment that we just had with the IMO regulations in 2020 coming fully into effect and removing the tropospheric aerosol as having a very large impact. And of course, Alan and I and a bunch of others on this call are co-authors and the paper will be published as well. So anyway, on that note, I don't know, Walker, did you want to respond to that, or?
I think you make a very good point that almost all of the studies I talked about today were global scale, and a global scale intervention that tries to cool the entire planet by 1 degree Celsius and averages 2.5 watts per meter squared of radiative forcing change across the entire globe is very, very different from a very small localized intervention. And for the record, I think it would be fantastic if it's possible, if it ends up being possible for Australia to mitigate the worst damage to the Great Barrier Reef and preserve this incredible, beautiful natural phenomenon without adverse effects to other parts of the globe. That would be amazing. It's just a little outside my area of expertise. And I should say that I'm not intrinsically opposed to outdoor experiments, especially on such a small scale where they could not possibly have lasting impacts to population or climate. So by all means, I think that I think that small scale experiments are okay in that regard. So yes, I think you make some good points, and thank you for contributing to the discussion when it comes to that particular topic.
Okay, so Jonathan, you haven't spoken yet. Go ahead.
Great, thanks. Walker, are you familiar with something called the bystander effect that exists in psychology? The bystander effect. It cuts down the urgency that people feel to help with a situation that they're nearby to. And it's because of the fact that there's a group of people that other than themselves might help. And I was thinking that if we promote the teleconnections problem too heavily, we might create some version of this bystander effect where nobody wants to do a local experiment because of this fear of hurting someone somewhere else. And anything that makes it harder for us to get some local experimentation going is very corrosive to advancing in this area, since we have to wait 5 to 10 years for the models to get better. And the models may never approach reality itself. We really have to get to experimentation. I mean, the world itself is our model, so to speak. So have you thought at all about how the overemphasis of the teleconnection might be corrosive to the advancement of technology?
That's an interesting question. And I'm not sure, because I see the point you're trying to make. But on the other hand, I don't think that we should refrain from publishing. I don't think that we should refrain from publishing results because we're afraid of the impacts that the impacts that they will have on psychologically on people who might be inclined to otherwise do those experiments. I think that if somebody reads a paper and concludes that if somebody reads a group of papers that together conclude that there is a strong teleconnection risk, and that causes them to choose not to that chooses them not to do a particular experiment or to be more careful about the experiment they try to do. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I also think that global scale experiments in climate models are not likely to directly impact whether choose to do extremely small localized experiments, such as the experiment on the Hornet recently. So I get the point you're trying to make. I'm not sure I agree with it.
Okay. It sounds like we had Robert, and then I think we'll wrap it up because we've kept Walker here for a long time in the end, and you know it's a bit of a you get to present and be the poster child for all kinds of questions. So
yeah,
Robert, go ahead.
Look, it's just been so awesome and informative. So thanks so much, Walker, for all that you've shared with us. With the Great Barrier Reef coral bleaching effort, you know, the idea that by doing MCB locally in the Great Barrier Reef. Now, I totally support this experiment, but at the same time, I'm sort of worried that the causes of coral bleaching are likely to be coming from hot water from the Central Pacific. You know, there's going to be a big blob of hot water that's just going to move across, and nothing that you do in the Great Barrier Reef for clouds in the Great Barrier Reef, like you needed to have been working on a place in the Central Pacific where the heat came from, rather than at the end. Similarly, if you wanted to reduce the intensity of hurricanes hitting the US, you need a systems approach to it. So can you comment on that?
So in terms of the actual dynamics of the Great Barrier Reef, I'm not really familiar with the factors that impact the health of the coral there. But I think that sounds very reasonable. That, excuse me, from a lot of the studies we've seen, that I mean, we know that all the different parts of the Earth are connected in different ways, and that we see that deploying marine cloud brightening in one part of the globe can affect the climate and the Earth system in other parts of the globe that are even those very far removed from the injection site. So I think it's very plausible that that's a valid point. That it may be more effective to, if you want to cool the ocean water in one particular region, you may need to focus your intervention on another part of the globe. I think that sounds very plausible at this point in the research.
Very much applies to hurricanes in the Atlantic. You know, you're not going to reduce the intensity of hurricane landfall by brightening the clouds in the teeth of the hurricane coming in. You have to go back to the seeding point.
So thank you, Walker. Alan just put in some papers, I believe, and that seem to corroborate Robbie's point. I actually, in our paper, Harrison, Daniel Harrison, who's doing part of that the MCB effort in the Great Barrier Reef, has claimed in his podcast anyway that there's a gyre around the reefs that is one of the reasons why the MCB and the Great Barrier Reef would be somewhat more a localized impact on the sea surface. Is my understanding. So I mean, I'm getting it from Daniel Harrison. And I would say that, there's a difference between a very, let's just keep the heat wave from destroying the corals for a few days or whatever it is, than an actual long-term cooling of a particular area. So anyway, Walker, did you want to make some final comments, or?
Not especially. I just want to thank everybody for the opportunity to present. I learned a lot from putting the presentation together. I don't have a lot of time to read papers at my job, but it's something I should do more of just as an academic. So the opportunity to have to go and read a bunch of papers to put a presentation together, I think was really helpful for me. And I also learned a lot from the discussion. So a big thank you to Ron, especially for inviting me to give a talk.
Thank you, and excellent presentation, Walker. Thank you very much. I think you brought a lot to the table and a lot for us to chew on. So thank you very much, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much as well. Can I just say I've put 2 more papers there as well in the chat if it's of any use.
Excellent.
Bravo, Walker. Bravo. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right, take care, everybody.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Can you just stay so we can save the chat, please?
Yeah,
Robbie?
if particularly the SC folks want to stay for a little debrief, we can do that.
Yeah, those papers charge you to get them, so if you want to download them, you can.
What'd you say, Alan?
They often charge you to take those.
Oh, okay.